Thank you very much for being here today in the name of all of our team. I will be presenting a bit about the backcasting scenarios development in the Locaw project, what we have done with that. We have developed backcasting scenario development as part of this backcasting scenarios as part of our project for 4 of the case studies, following a bit of different methodologies. We will explain a bit about that, what that means in our case studies, with the purpose of sort of implementing these ideas about what the future should be in all these organizations, with the participation of organizational members, especially people coming from management, from the management team of all the organizations. Although in some cases, like in the university, for example, that was not the case, and I will explain a bit why we didn't use part of the management of the university to do the backcasting scenarios. So, first of all, what are backcasting scenarios? They are a methodology for defining normative visions of the future and the pathways to reach those normative visions of the future. They have been a useful method of decision-making during the last 2 decades, let's say, more or less, till the 90s, when they started to be implemented in the Netherlands, in Sweden in the first place, and then they started becoming more popular at different levels. They have been also a useful qualitative tool in going towards the future in issues of climate change. They have appeared at the beginning as a reaction to some discontent with traditional methods of forecasting, because forecasting was considered to just extrapolate existing trends and have some problems with that. Shell has done some of that forecasting, you know, development of scenarios in the 70s, thinking that they could prepare for the future and for the unexpected of the future. But they discovered that some of their even their wildest scenarios were sometimes not adequate for what was going on in reality. And in issues of climate changes, we deal with very complex problems. We know that we need to define sort of a normative vision of where we want to go towards. And these visions are complex, they involve multiple actors, and we want those visions to be articulated in a participatory way, because ensuring participation of relevant stakeholders and relevant actors can ensure early commitment to goals and can facilitate complex problem solving. We know that when we talk about climate change, we have many different dimensions involved. And we have many different actors that can sometimes act in contradictory ways. So using this methodology, we can solve these problems at an early stage of the process, just by raising them up for discussion within the backcasting scenarios. So how did we do this in Locaw? We used a combination of stakeholder input and researcher input to generate the future images and desired end states. I would say here that the majority of input was done by the participants, by the members of the different organizations where we did the backcasting. The input of the researchers was more in terms of, for example, doing some assessments of what those visions meant in terms of carbon reduction, in terms of emissions reduction, so that we could give an image of whether the targets were being actually fulfilled by the defined pathways, the way the pathways were defined by the organization. So we were a bit of a support in that, let's say. We used the backcasting scenario approach that was process-oriented and participatory. What that means is we gave a lot of attention to the process, because we're not interested only in the final vision, but we were interested in how this process was organized within the organization, because we also wanted to make sure that something beyond the Locaw project came out of the backcasting scenarios, in the sense of involving workers within this process and making sure that they could then continue with the work. We actually had some very good ideas in some of the organization. For example, in the University of A Coruña, which was one of our case studies, we actually talked about establishing a network of people that are going to keep working on these future visions and working on these strategies to reach these future visions. And we were very lucky to have the director of the Office of the Environment, who's today present here, who contributed to these visions and who will help us do the implementation afterwards. So we have an actual implementation of some of the things within the organization. So what we did is we involved members of organizations in several workshops, as I said before, First of all, to create these images of the future and then enrich them with perspectives of the different actors in the organization. Analyze them, analyze these images in terms of potential emissions reductions. The way we did this is with some expert input and assessment of the potential carbon emissions, carbon footprint of the different pathways. Then we mapped the strategic pathways to reach the images by also identifying major uncertainties, the areas where things were problematic, and potential blockages. And what we did with these visions is then we used them, the definition of the pathways, to simulate them in an agent-based model in order to assess the effectiveness of different combinations. When we thought about going towards these alternative futures and simulating the different pathways, we needed this vision of how we get there. That should be participatory in these cases, because otherwise it makes no sense. And we wanted to simulate and see if those policies that were defined by the organizations in going towards those future visions were actually going to be effective or not, if they're going to work according to plan, let's say. There are different stages that we followed to design the backcasting process. The first step had to do with the stakeholder analysis. When we've done the backcasting, we know from the literature that this is a very important stage. Make sure that the stakeholders that are involved, on the one hand, do not have major conflicts that can actually break the workshop, but some conflict is always good, because then we have debate and we have a creative generation of ideas. So we made sure that in the different case studies we had the right stakeholders. This differed across the organizations because, for example, at the university, because the management of the university is an elected management and it's a short-term management, so it's about 4 years and maybe sometimes they stand for re-election, we preferred to use workers, so a combination of administrative and academic staff, to define these visions in order to make them more radical, make them more creative in terms of going towards significant reductions of CO2 emissions. But then we enrich these visions with participation and input from students and some minimal participation and input from the management of the university. But this was not the case, for example, in an organization like Aqua Team or in Enel Green Power in Italy, where actually middle and sometimes members of the high management were involved in the backcasting scenarios. Within our first meetings, what we did was define these future images. So in each case study, we have had a number of 2 or 3 scenarios sometimes that came out of the first workshop. I should say here that in the case of the municipality of Groningen, we followed a different path, because the municipality already had a quite, let's say, radical and good plan for reducing emissions in terms of technology reductions for 2050. So they didn't need to do this again. They didn't need to define this. They had this master plan where they had emissions reductions, and we did a lot to convince them to develop visions for changing of behavior, but that was not possible in the end. And so what we did then was derive this from theory. I will explain about this a bit later. The third step, of course, was refining these images and identifying the exact targets of reduction for each of the areas of practices that we analyzed in Locaw, which were energy use, work-related mobility, and waste generation and management. And what we did here is actually put numbers on things. So we thought about what type of reduction would we need, what percentages of reduction we would want to have in each of these areas for each organization. And finally, in a separate meeting, what we did is define these alternative pathways to reach the visions. I have 2 examples here of the types of visions that we created. Of course, the visions are much more fleshed out, but we could not present all the vision here because of time limitation. For example, in the case of the University of Coruña, out of the first meetings, we got out 3 different scenarios. The characteristics, there are different characteristics in these future visions, and let's say they are sort of occupying a place on a continuum from a more business as usual or a bit more conservative scenario towards a more radically different scenario. The conservative scenario basically stated that the university will stay in the same place and will use the same infrastructure as they have now, but it involved many changes in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of installing, for example, renewable energy sources, in terms of improving mobility, especially as public transport is concerned, the building of a student residence which would considerably limit the transportation needs of students between home and the university in this case. Sort of an intermediate vision talked about the university as actually not using the same infrastructures as today, but rather being moved to the city. Being moved to the city across a series of small rooms across town that would be study rooms and also online teaching rooms, sometimes group meeting rooms, that would use different places in the city and that would be sustainable in terms of energy consumptions. They would have energy self-sufficiency, complete recycling or almost complete recycling, and of course mobility would be sustainable, as in the city you can basically walk or use public transportation to go almost anywhere. So these were thought as support for online teaching. The vision here was that online teaching would be majoritary in this case, would be what we would mostly do. And then the virtual university, which stated that we do not need any sort of forum for meeting, we do not need the rooms, we will have online teaching only. This relied on heavy technological developments. So, for example, in this scenario, people talked about the possibilities of already holograms being developed, and so you could actually have the sensation of contact even if you do not have exact contact with other people. And what they said here is we would have a few European universities that would be online teaching only for all these universities using advanced technologies at home. So there would be support for this, for the installation of these advanced technologies in the homes of citizens in this. In terms of another example I have here is from Enel Green Power as a private organization. So they were similar in a way in the ones produced by the university, in the sense that they also talk about changes in infrastructure and about different sort of infrastructure settings that they can have. One is that Enel Green Power will remain in the same place, but infrastructure will be made more efficient. The other talks about a green office. This would be a change in office practices, in the way offices are designed, that will be situated outside of the urban environment in green areas and close to workers' residence. And in this case, workers talked about, in fact, managers talked about only energy from renewable sources being used and high recycling rates. And finally, in the virtual office, which is, almost all work is done from home, and there's almost no, again, connection among the workers. I have here a few key elements, let's say, of the future visions. I've already talked a bit about the University of A Coruña and about Enel. But anyway, the focus, let's say, at the university or the vision of the future they were considered the key actor for sustainability education of workers and of future generations with this double-folded role, let's say. And so they were considered to be the actors that could actually be front runners in issues of sustainability. In terms of Aqua Team, what they stressed mostly is investing a lot as a company strategy in recycling water and manufacturing it, so investing a lot in technological innovation, which would in turn lead to a lot of reduction. And another issue that was common here to the other companies that my colleagues Nora and David will present is that they thought about that sustainability and safety objectives would be comparable, talking about reparations and maintenance of systems, for example, as reparation and maintenance would be done in the future in this vision with robots. So you would not need with machines. You would not need any human intervention here for the reparations, because they say they entail some danger. In terms of the municipality of Groningen, they stated in their future vision that they will fully rely on renewable sources. They have a carbon neutral objective by 2050. And what we did in these visions in the project was to design theory-derived visions for changes in human behavior. So a few things about the pathways, the characteristics of the pathways. The way we did the pathways is every 10 years, going backwards from 2050 to the present year, to 2012. A lot appeared in the first stage, in the first 10 years, as a sort of a forced frugality of coping with crisis ideas. So within this period, what was thought is that big investments are not possible, so the pathway towards sustainability would mainly be centered on efficiency, on improving efficiency, energy efficiency, on reducing costs, and reducing mobility that is costly in this sense for the organization. But then from 2020 to 2050, most organizations have talked about strategic investments and becoming front runners. So they saw this as a great advantage for the companies and for the public organizations. In terms of the UDC, the university, they talked about strategic investments and the possibility for sustainability education becoming a really big part of the university. While Aqua Team and Enel Green Power had talked a lot about the possibility to invest in innovations that would put them as front runners in sustainability. Finally, in the last 20 years, let's say up to 2050, there will be a rollout of these first investments in technology and in innovation and in sustainability within these organizations. So all the organizations would have high investments in technology, improving safety and sustainability, for example. They will roll out the innovations on the market so that it would become a competitive advantage compared to other organizations. And then finally, in this last stage is, let's say, a consolidation stage for all organizations where there will be new practices will be implemented, and there will also be radical changes in terms of styles of working and office settings. Here, flexible working comes into place, and office settings in terms of combining home work with workplace, but also having all kinds of offices that are multifunction. For the municipality of Groningen, as I said, we used a different approach where we defined the pathways based on theory, based on our previous research that my colleagues from Groningen will present in a few minutes. And so the main issues here, the main, let's say, pathways derived from the theory were that we will strengthen biospheric values, as we know that they influence sustainable practices. And they are stable over time, but the way we can influence them is by having situational cues that can actually make them salient. Then we will strengthen environmental self-identity, and we'll in a minute see why that is important, and create autonomy of choice, as in general, in order to have a strong environmental identity, there has to be certain autonomy of choice within the workplaces. People have to perceive that they have freely chosen to perform sustainable behaviors. So in terms of the few main ideas, the conclusions we've got from this development of future images is that most organizations, both public and private, talk about, when talking about sustainability and a sustainable future, they talk about being a front runner and about assuming the costs of that as an advantage. So they are talking about the fact that that would give them a competitive advantage in terms of if they're a private company, and in terms of public companies or public organizations, they consider that to be part of their main tasks, part of their values. They are willing to assume the role of key actors, and that's the way it's seen, the role of key actors beyond the workplace. So they can influence workers in the workplace, but they would like, or they think that in order to promote sustainability, they would have to also influence workers beyond the workplace. So in that connection with the home, they consider training of staff as essential, training of staff in terms of sustainability and sustainable practices. And another important idea that came out in all the definitions of the pathways was that we should combine objectives and both promote and adopt technological innovations. Combine objectives in the sense of, for example, health and sustainability, or safety and sustainability, as interesting synergies there that can come out and can be positive for sustainability. And we could also, all the organizations would like to both promote and adopt technological innovations. So these were our conclusions.